like I need to start off today's show by apologizing for not being here on Wednesday. But welcome to In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. But yeah, I was out on Wednesday. Didn't want to be or expect to be, but unfortunately, on Tuesday evening, when my wife got home from work, she noticed a funky smell in the house. And she asked me some questions about what I thought it could be. I'm like, I don't know. We'll figure it out whenever I get home from work myself. And that's exactly what I did. And to be discreet about it, it was a bit of some nastiness from the pupper, from the dog, from our dog Lily. And we thought maybe it could have just been a one-off incident. Maybe she ate something bad. But then overnight, the mess continued. And again, that's probably about as much as I need to say without getting too deep into the weeds with it. But yeah, my dog Lily woke up on early Wednesday morning and was not feeling the best. And so I ended up taking her to the vet, see what was wrong. And thankfully, the vets believed it was just something she may have eaten outside that she wasn't supposed to, and gave her some medicine and an injection and things like that. And she's been doing pretty well over the past couple of days. But just in case any of you didn't or were unaware of why there was no episode on Wednesday, then that's why. But we're here on Friday. It's a feel-good Friday. I'm feeling good, and I'm excited to be back. I hope I remember how to do this, right? Even though I'm just gone for one additional day. I enjoyed doing the Talking About the Hoosiers podcast Indiana football preview the other day. If you haven't checked that out and you want to deep dive into really all of my thoughts, Kyler Staley's thoughts, and Drew Rosenberg, his thoughts, check out that video on YouTube after you watch this show, the 2024 Indiana football preview. We dive into who we think is going to be the best players on offense, defense. We talk about the record, what expectations should really be. I know that stuff we talk about on this show too, but it's more, the whole show's about it, obviously. We try to mix it up here on In Touch with Indiana Sports, not stay focused on one thing for entirely too long. So if you want to check that out and get excited for some football, be sure to check out the latest episode of the Talking About the Hoosiers podcast, where I got to make a guest appearance. And I'll say that one thing that I realized as soon as we got on, that is the first time since probably I was in college, which was at this point I graduated in fall of 2019. So yeah, nearly 5 years ago since I've been in college, or since I got out of college, I should say. Being on that show was the first time since then where I hadn't either been hosting and or producing a show, which it was a fun experience. I felt it was very loose. I feel like there was less that I had to be worried about when it comes to driving the show. I could just kind of sit there and talk and explain my thoughts, and it was a good time. So, but yeah, check that out over also on HoosierIllustrated.com or the YouTube page as well. Be sure to subscribe and, get all of our football content, basketball content as it releases. Again, happy Friday. Today's a solo dolo episode for me. And what I mean by that is no guests. On Wednesday, I was supposed to have Deion Sanders joining me. Obviously, that show didn't happen, and he was unable to make it on today, and no Kyler Staley today as well. He's going to come on Monday in place of Alec Lasley, who will be out all next week. So doing a little shifting around. We may try to have Deion Sanders. I don't know if we'll have him on next week, but we'll definitely have him on again in the future. It'll just kind of depend. But I was wanting to talk with him on Wednesday about the newly released AP poll for college football, the preseason AP poll, because he is one of the contributors to what I mean by that. He is somebody who writes his own. He is one of the AP voters, I should say, that gets a count for the top 25 and that stuff. So I would have loved to pick his brain on who he thought was going to be the best, maybe something that may be uncommon from some of the others. But I guess while we're talking about the AP poll, we might as well dive into it now, though, right? And we'll focus strictly on Big Ten teams that got in. and where they landed. And one thing I've got to get used to is the Pac-12 teams being a part of the Big Ten when I count these, because it's very easy to leave them off. But in the Big Ten, number 2, Ohio State, number 3, Oregon, number 8, Penn State, number 9, Michigan. Let's see, what else do we have after that? I think you have to go all the way down to number 23 for USC and then number 25 for Iowa. So not too different from what the coaches poll looks like. Obviously, the biggest difference really between the two polls in general is that you have coaches who vote on everything, and then you have the writers who vote on stuff. And one thing I've always kind of thought about the different polls, especially the coaches poll, they don't care. The coaches do not care at all who's ranked where, at least for the most part, they don't care. I want to say they don't care at all. But they're just doing it because they have to do it. Just another one of their obligations. The writers, I feel like, even though they may not watch every team, and they probably don't watch a ton of them, they probably watch a good majority, but they're not watching every single team out there. But they definitely have more of a, I feel like, an objective lens, or maybe even, I hate to say that the coaches poll isn't as reliable, but I just don't, there really isn't a point in a coaches poll, right? Why involve the people who have their own teams and have their own teams to worry about, and they don't really care what's going on with the other programs? Whereas the writers, they're following everything for the most part. And then to top it all off, when you get, and I know we talked about this before, but when you get later on in the season to the college football playoff rankings, both of these polls become obsolete. So I guess it's all just for nothing. Obviously, no Indiana in this poll. You won't see Indiana in any poll unless they get off to a really hot start. And I guess we can talk about that. What would it take for Indiana to find their way into one of these rankings at some point in the year? Because you start off with FIU and Western Illinois. None of those, no matter what happens in those games, no matter how bad you win, I mean, if you lose, it's definitely not a good thing. But in terms of the style of way that you win, I don't think a win in either of those two games is going to garner you any votes. Now, when you get on to UCLA, you may start to catch people's attention. You won't be in the top 25, but there is a chance you may see a vote or two. And again, depending on the way that you win those games. If you squeak out 3 close games, especially in those first 2 where you should blow them out, then you won't receive any votes. But if you blow out the first 2 and then you handle UCLA pretty well on the road, you'll get the attention of some people. Maybe get a couple of votes in the AP or coaches poll. And I'm probably from here on out, for the most part, I'm going to probably just reference the AP poll until the college football playoff rankings become the poll of choice, which won't be for, I think it's week 10, which is crazy that it's that late in the season that they do that. I wish it was earlier, but that's the way that it goes. But after that, you've got Charlotte, your last non-conference game. Again, that game probably won't do a lot for you. And then after that, you got Maryland and Northwestern. And I think the only way Indiana finds themselves in the top 25 early in the season, I should say, or maybe even at any point, for being honest, is if they happen to start the year 6-0, beating Maryland and Northwestern. And that's not something that I think fans are expecting, nor should you really be expecting. Should you be surprised if it happens? I think there's a couple different ways you can look at it. And we kind of lay it out in the talking about the Hoosiers football preview, how there is a road to 6-0, but it's just hard to imagine any Indiana football team, no matter who the head coach is, not having a slip up or two somewhere in between. But if Indiana happens to find themselves at 6-0, that's probably where you may see them crack the top 25 for the first time. And then after that, you'd face Nebraska. And you'd probably have a really cool atmosphere on homecoming weekend. I mean, you would. And not only that, it's Hoosier Hysteria weekend. So it'd be probably the biggest, maybe one of the biggest weekends of the year in Bloomington. So there you have it, little Indiana football rankings talk. A couple pieces of news. We'll stick with the football side for a little bit. Nick Kidwell, offensive lineman Nick Kidwell, is out for the season for Indiana. And that is, I mean, no injury is a good injury, especially one that's out for the season, but to lose somebody who was projected to be a very important piece to your offensive line, that's not good for any team, especially a team like Indiana who may not have the depth of schools like the Ohio States or the Oregons and that type of a thing. So losing losing Kidwell, I should say, is not going to be good. You still have Carter Smith, Mike Kadick, Trey Weedig, and Tyler Stevens expected to be starting on the line. Now, maybe that shifts a little bit depending on who's going to fill that fifth spot at the line for Indiana now. But nonetheless, it's still a big loss, especially when you've lost guys from last year like Zach Carpenter, Matthew Bedford, and Khalil Benson. So not only that, you're already kind of restarting, I guess, what your line looked like from last year. It doesn't mean it won't be a bad line. You're just going to be a little shorter on the depth chart. And maybe sometimes players take that opportunity and step up, and that's their time to kind of show their worth. So, and Bob Bostad, the offensive line coach, is known for having his players ready to go. So we may potentially see that from one of the depth pieces for Indiana's offensive line. On the other side of things, or it's really not on the other side when it comes, it's more of just a different position now. There is a lot of kind of quiet momentum, if you will, with one of the top QB prospects and really one of the top prospects overall for the class of 2025, and that's five-star Julian Juju Lewis. A lot of momentum swinging in Indiana's favor right now, based on who you talk to, who you kind of follow on social media, that type of stuff. But he's been committed to USC for a very long time. But even though he's been committed, he's taken official visits elsewhere, and it's kind of a weird thing that, and I get it, even though you're committed, you want to be able to use all of your visits. And I don't even know if there's limits anymore. I think we've talked about that before. You can take as many official visits as you want. But I've always thought it's a little fishy when you're committed to a program, but you're still kind of flirting with other programs. You know, it's kind of like being in a relationship with somebody, but you're still going to date other people. Like, that doesn't sound right, you know? And I know this is not the exact same thing, but that's kind of the image you can put in your head when you're thinking about this type of stuff, because the USC fans want to know you're all in. It's a commitment for a reason. And I know this day and age in college football and basketball, whatever it may be, it doesn't really mean a whole lot at all until you get on campus. And even then, sometimes it doesn't mean anything. The national letter of intent, that almost means nothing nowadays. So whenever, and I think I'm kind of unlocking myself here, but I do want to kind of share my thoughts on like how it's aggravating, especially on social media. And I'm not talking about Julian Lewis specifically, but when you see guys who make posts that are like 1,000% committed, I'm ready to be a part of, I don't know, Georgia Southern Nation. I don't know. I'm just throwing a random school out there. And then they end up decommitting 3 months later because they got a better offer from, I don't know, Memphis or something like that. That's so stupid. And I know these are kids. But at the same time, I don't know. This is probably a very old man yells at cloud type of thing that I'm complaining about. And maybe a few of you can relate. Because I've been told that I am an old soul in a younger person's body. And I do have takes like that sometimes. So, but that's just kind of it annoys. Like, I never take any commitment as seriously as you used to be able to, just because you never know what's going to change. So even if, let's just say Julian Lewis decommits from USC and chooses Indiana and says he's 1,000% committed, and this goes for anybody, not just Juju Lewis, but any commitment. You always need to keep an open mind that could change in this era of NIL. If something falls through, and especially if he's not on campus yet, which obviously he won't be, not at this point in the year, anything can change. But anyway, regardless, there's a lot of momentum surrounding him, and there's people of, I believe his name, he's from 24/7 Sports. His name's Tom Loy. He does not expect Julian Lewis to keep his commitment to USC. as we were just talking about. He kind of expects it to be one of three schools, and he kind of tiers them a little bit. There's really two tiers with three schools. The top tier, Indiana and Colorado, and then below that, Auburn. And he credits Tino Sunseri, which is Indiana's quarterback's coach. He credits Julian Lewis's relationship with him as being a very strong factor in what's kind of made Julian Lewis attracted to Indiana. And that would be such a monumental get for Indiana if they are able to not only land him, but keep him and actually, get him on the roster for upcoming seasons. I mean, at that point, your quarterback room, first of all, becomes pretty loaded. You've got next year, so you won't have Curtis Rourke. You'll have Taven Jackson. You'll have Tyler Cherry, Alberto Mendoza, and the newly incoming, potentially, Julian Lewis, if this works out. But the amount of momentum that the Indiana football program would receive from a commitment of somebody of the caliber of Julian Lewis, I mean, there's likely going to be a very positive fallout, and that's probably not the best word to use. It's just kind of what came into my brain when thinking about how to describe it. But there's going to be probably a lot of dominoes that fall after somebody like Julian Lewis decides to go to Indiana, and if that ends up being the case. And that could be, especially depending on how this first season goes with Curt Cignetti, that could be the beginning of the opening of the floodgates for a new era of high-level recruiting for Indiana football that they've never seen before. And the Tom Allen era did not even fairly well. They did well for what was expected of them when it comes to the recruiting trail. But this will usher in a whole new level of expectations. I mean, things that Indiana fans probably have never seen before in their lifetime, unless they were around for the Rose Bowl whenever that happened back in, was it the 30s or the 40s? It was a long time ago. And forgive me if I'm way off on the year, but I know it's been eons since they went to the Rose Bowl, whenever that would have been. But yeah, that's where we're at with Julian Lewis, and there's, again, a lot of momentum with it, and I'm excited to see what ends up happening with that. And I don't have my own prediction. I do think Indiana has a good chance to land it, just based on really over the entire summer. There's been a lot of quiet momentum surrounding Indiana, and a lot of the national guys don't really humor Indiana very much because it's Indiana, and they think that there's no way somebody like that would go to Indiana. So anyway, that's where we're at. One more piece of football news, and this is pretty cool, actually, if you haven't seen this. They're implementing, when I say they, Indiana University is adding to the football game day experience. They're adding something called B-Town Boulevard, which is going to turn the south lawn of Memorial Stadium into kind of a festival-like atmosphere with food trucks and special, like an outdoor bar and some live music and that type of stuff. And that's really cool. Indiana needs to do more for their football game day experience, because for years, it's the joke has always been that the biggest tradition of Indiana football is the fans leaving at the end of the third quarter, or even at halftime. And it doesn't matter if they're winning too, because and outside of me saying that's a tradition, there's more often than not more people, at least it seems this way, more people in the tailgate fields than there are in Memorial Stadium. There's people who come just to tailgate and they'll never step foot inside Memorial Stadium. And this may not 100% solve that problem, because, again, this is still something happening outside of the stadium. And this will probably end up being the case if Indiana ends up having a bad game or something at home. People will still leave the stadium, but they may not necessarily go as far away from the stadium as they would previously. They'll go to the south lawn and hang out and have a couple cold ones, or maybe some sort of gourmet hot dog or whatever it is they end up having on this special menu, or these food trucks that are supposed to be outside of the stadium. So that's an interesting little, it's not really a perk, but there's ticket packages available. So there's a free version of this, but there's also a paid version where you get access to different parts of B-Town Boulevard. And I'm not sure what all of that entails, but I'll be curious to see what kind of bands they bring along. I'm sure they're not going to be anything, super extravagant in terms of like huge names. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe especially for like homecoming, you'll see bigger names appear on the concert stage. But I'm sure you'll get a few like cover bands and that type of stuff. You also may get probably some local acts. You'll probably see Clayton Anderson make an appearance or two, um, as he has been known to do in the past, not necessarily at Memorial Stadium, but just around Bloomington. So, but I'm glad that Indiana's doing that. They need to continue to find ways to enhance the football game day experience. And I think this is a good start, especially when you've got all this momentum this year. And I mean, the South Lawn kind of B-Town Boulevard vibes. It may be the place to be after a big win. And this may be one of Indiana's best new traditions if it ends up being something that appeals to a lot of people. And I think it will. So kudos to the university administration as I take a sip of my coffee real quick. Excuse me. Dude, doing the solo dolo, there may or may not be a few additional little edits where you kind of notice that it jumps from one thing to the next and it's not as seamless as if I were to keep talking. Because again, there's no commercials or anything. I can't transition into a guest segment like I do typically. So I've just got to keep on rambling, keep on talking. And I'm enjoying it. I'm having a good time so far. But there comes a time where you need to kind of clear the throat a little bit. And I think we are at one of those times once again. But nonetheless, we're back. And let's keep moving forward. And we're going to move away from the football side of things into something that, well, actually, we should have an answer to this question here at some point during this episode. And that is where Malachi Moreno, big Indiana prospect, is going to continue his basketball career at. And he's got a top 8 that includes a number of Power 4 schools, Power 5 schools, I guess, and if you include the Big East in basketball. But depending on who you ask, it's down to pretty much Indiana and Kentucky. And I don't want to talk too much about speculation because by the time this episode comes out, we'll have an answer. And hopefully at some point during this episode, I'd like to see what I'm probably going to end up doing is I'm going to save the final few minutes of this episode for reaction to what ends up playing out in this Malachi Moreno announcement. But I highly expect it to be either Indiana or Kentucky. I've heard people say that he's leaning heavily toward one and the other, so I don't have a definitive prediction. If you would have asked me a couple days ago, I would have said Indiana, but today it does appear that there is, again, shifting back and forth to Kentucky. It kind of reminds me of the Boogie Fland recruitment from last year because that was going both ways. Indiana, Kentucky for the longest time ended up being Kentucky. And now he's not even going to Kentucky. He followed John Calipari to Arkansas, understandably so. But that's where we're at with Malachi Moreno. What I'll probably do, I'll pop back in towards the end of this episode, and that'll probably be the final thing that we talk about before we wrap things up, is a reaction to whether or not he ends up choosing the Hoosiers. If he chooses the Cats, or even maybe it's somebody else. Maybe it's one of the other 6 schools that are in his top 8, and he has nothing to say for Indiana or Kentucky. So we will jump into that later on in this episode. Let's go ahead and jump into a couple of YouTube comments, right, from last episode or previous couple of episodes. Herbal writes in, start a college football pick'em group when the time comes, John. That is definitely something that I want to do if I can make myself come around to putting it together. And because I know on previous shows that I've worked with, they've done college football pick'ems, and I do think that'd be a great way to get some viewership interaction, especially in the early stages of the show still. So thank you for the suggestion, Herbal. And I will, if I decide to do that, I will let you guys know here on the show, probably at some point next week, because I mean, believe it or not, we're almost a week away from college football. We are finally at the end of what I keep referring to as talking season. Maybe I haven't referred to on this show that much. Maybe I have. I forget what I say on different shows, man. I work on a Louisville Athletic show in the afternoons, and I'm not a host on that show, but I do contribute in some way, shape, and form, depending on the day. It depends on how much I contribute. But man, sometimes all of it runs together sometimes, man. Especially when it's something that's not specific to a certain team. I forget where I talk about it at. But either way, it is talking season. And what I mean by that, if you've never heard that phrase, it's really just speculation. Like there's nothing. We're totally talking about what we think we're going to see, whether it be on the football field, the basketball court, anything. And I'm ready to finally see some stuff. And I know next week's not when Indiana plays. Next week is the infamous week 0. Some people like it, some people don't. And the slate of games for week 0 is not the best. I believe we have talked about it briefly. Some of the week 0 games, I'll go over them again here in just a second. Yeah, there's not a lot to get excited about when it comes to the slate of games for week 0. And let me go and pull up right now. Just set the top 25. Let me get up all of the games. Yeah. So on the week 0 Saturday, August 24th, you've got 4 games. One of them featuring a ranked opponent, and that is number 10 Florida State taking on Georgia Tech in the Aer Lingus College Football Classic. And that is the now annual game that takes place over in Ireland, which those games have been really good for the most part since they've been doing those. I remember specifically a couple of years ago when Nebraska took on Northwestern and Scott Frost did the I mean, it was the beginning of the end for Scott Frost when he called an onside kick with the lead against Northwestern coming out of halftime. Like he was just trying to be cool. Like he wanted to come run up the score. And that ended up being the big momentum shift that Northwestern needed to end up winning that game. And that I don't believe that was a good Northwestern team either. But that was the icing on the cake for how chaotic and terrible the Scott Frost era was for Nebraska. And I think it'll be tough for not only for Nebraska fans to forget that, but for college football fans in general, because that was not only a head scratcher. I mean, it made the game interesting. I mean, obviously it was a great game, a great finish, but maybe we'll see something similar when Florida State and Georgia Tech face each other in the noon slot, the very first game of the 2024 college football season. And if you're into sports betting, FSU currently 11.5-point favorites. And I don't know if I'm going to, I may bet just for funsies in week 0. Maybe I won't, because I don't like to bet on anything if I don't have a good feeling about it. I don't like to just bet to bet. I mean, I know I'm excited to have it back with college football and NFL and all that stuff, but it's really hard to get a feel for teams in the first couple of weeks. That's why it's better to just kind of stick with what you know, at least in my opinion. But, whenever it comes next week, I'll let you know if I end up deciding to bet on any of these games. But the other 3 games to get us going on week 0, Montana State at New Mexico. Is Montana State in the FBS now? I mean, again, that game itself isn't super interesting. No, they're still in the FCS. But for some, they do have a spread? Yeah, they have a spread for that game. And usually they don't give you spreads for games that feature FCS opponents. Maybe it's different because it's week 0. But no, but that wouldn't be the case, because if you go down and look at Delaware State and Hawaii, Delaware State's an FCS program, and there's no spread for that game. But here's what's interesting. So I mentioned Montana State being at the FCS level, Division 1.5, as I like to call it sometimes. They're taking on New Mexico, a team from the Mountain West. Montana State is favored by 9 points. So not only are they a tier lower than the FBS program, New Mexico, they're also on the road in that game, and they're favored by 9 points. So it's a sneaky, interesting game if you're just somebody who wants to take in all of what college football has to offer in the week 0 matchups. And I guess, so I already mentioned Delaware State and Hawaii. That's actually the nightcap, and it's more of a nightcap than you may realize. It's an 11:59 p.m. start, basically midnight, obviously. And I mean, if you're a part of the sickos committee, as they call it, somebody who just can't get enough, then fire up your TV or really just keep it on, because I'm sure if you're watching Delaware State and Hawaii, you probably watch the other games at this point. And you're just gonna have some late night college football in the state of Hawaii, featuring two teams that probably won't be very relevant in their respective leagues. Hawaii's interesting just because they're Hawaii, and it's kind of cool that there's a Division I football program in Hawaii, but we don't get one in Alaska. I do think they have football. I just don't think that they are Division I. But isn't that crazy how we have a major program, even if they're not very good, in pretty much, I mean, not even pretty much, in every state in the United States except for Alaska? Imagine traveling to Alaska for a football game, especially in like early December. That'd be nuts. And the game I skipped over unintentionally, it's because we were talking about FCS stuff. At 8 p.m., we got SMU at Nevada. SMU, a new member of the ACC conference. And again, that SMU, Cal, and Stanford in the ACC, I don't know why. That's just weirder. That's weirder than any of the stuff that's coming to the Big Ten. And maybe it's because it's forced. It felt like those additions were forced just for the ACC to stay relevant. They were really just kind of the leftovers when it came to all the expansion, whether it be the SEC, Big Ten, Big 12. It feels like any of the leftovers just went to the ACC. I mean, unless you're Washington State or Oregon State, you just got completely left behind. But SMU, formerly of the American Athletic Conference, will be heavily favored on the road at Nevada, 27.5 points. And that just seems like a lot, man. I don't know a lot about either of these teams. I know SMU is usually decent, and they'll probably be okay in the ACC. But 27.5 points seems like a lot. So there you have it. Once again, the week 0 games. We won't do an in-depth preview of any of them, because I may just let you know what my picks end up being if I decide to go with anything as we get closer, I should say, to college football. And yeah, we'll go ahead and leave it at that as I take another swig of my coffee. I like this to be a kind of a relaxed feel. I don't want to try to do a bunch of edits. One thing I'd want to get comfortable with, and I think I'm already pretty good at it, or at least more comfortable with it. I don't want to say I'm good at it necessarily. I want to be okay with the silence every once in a while. Just have it. And what I mean by that is, it's like, don't worry about if there's 4 to 5 seconds of just nothing. I'm a big fan of the Theo Vaughn this past weekend with Theo Vaughn podcast. And one thing that I really admire about the way that he does his solo episodes is that I don't want to say he doesn't care, because I know he cares, but he is very comfortable in uncomfortable situations when it comes to maybe just forgetting what he was talking about and just moving on, and I want to carry myself like that. And hopefully I've done a decent enough job of it so far. I mean, there may be times where I legitimately do need to edit some stuff out if I just completely forget what I'm talking about and need to kind of reset my brain. But I do want I want these shows to be as raw as possible when it comes to just, the editing process. And I want it to kind of feel live when it's not live. And I know I've talked before how I eventually want it to be live, and that's still something we're going to experiment with down the road. We just got to figure out what the best way to test it out is. But I don't want this to feel like a super edited show. I want this to be, I want it to be like hanging out with your, I don't know. I don't want to say your buddy, because it just feels weird. And the only reason I even say that is because we have a commercial that runs to our radio station that airs for one of our talk shows. It's not even a sports talk show, but the commercial's like, it's just like hanging out with your buddies. And that's why I just kind of want to veer away from using that terminology, just because it's corny. But I'm a big cornball, so who knows? Let's unstun lock myself and move forward with with what I was going to get into next, which is another YouTube comment. And it's from my buddy, not my buddy. I would say, like, I don't know him personally, but it's somebody who I've talked with on previous shows that I've been on, Mr. Five Lefts. He had a strong comment on, or I should say a strong response to my Deion Sanders comments the other day. And I'll just read what he said. He says, embarrassing to who? Deion is acting like Deion. If you don't know by now that he backs up what he says and that he's a winner, I don't know what to tell you. If you think he isn't a winner because he went 4-8 last year at Colorado, a team that was 1-11 the previous year, then you're just showing your bias, in my opinion. Let's wait until he completes a season in the Big 12 before we decide if it was fair to rank him as second to last in the Big 12 coaching. Acting professional, what does that mean? Give me a break. He's a coach. Coaches don't follow scripts. I'm going to try to break that up into a few different things to kind of comment on. But I guess I'll start with this. It says, if you think he isn't a winner because he went 4-8 last year at Colorado, a team that was 1-11 the previous year, yes, I'll go ahead and say that is improvement. But, I mean, let's just be honest here. And there's two ways to define Deion Sanders being a winner. I'm not saying he's a loser as a player. I'm not even really calling him a loser as a coach. I mean, maybe I am. But as a player, I know that Deion Sanders was revolutionary. I know he was one of the most impactful guys in football. I'm specifically talking about him as a head coach at Colorado at the Division I FBS level. And, I mean, Five Lefts, to be quite honest, as a head coach, when you're 4-8, you're not a winner. I know you improved by 3 wins, but 4-8, when you're talking a big game, like you're going to take over whatever league you're a part of and go win the college football playoff, you're going to be expected to do a little more than 4-8. I'm sorry to say that. And he's going to be expected to do more than 4-8 this year. And if he turns 4-8 into 7-5, yeah, that's an improvement. And that will, I mean, not even that will likely. He'll definitely be around to continue to try to increase his, I guess, resume, if you will, with Colorado in the future, if he continues to take steps forward like that. My biggest issue with the Deion Sanders stuff last week, it's not necessarily about him as a human being. I know Deion's going to be Deion. I don't want him to be somebody that he's not. But to disrespect a reporter who had absolutely nothing to do with why he was pissed off, that's what I don't like. Nobody should treat anyone like that, okay? It's not Deion Sanders specifically. That could have been Kurt Signetti. That could have been Mike Woodson. You put any coach's name in place of Deion Sanders. If you say what he said to the reporter, not even really what he said, but just treated him like he did something wrong when he did absolutely nothing. That's my problem with what Deion Sanders did. Because for those of you who may have missed it, Deion Sanders was upset about a national CBS Big 12 coach rankings that showed him as being the second worst coach in the Big 12 coming into the season. And because of that, Deion Sanders, when talking to a reporter who was affiliated with CBS, but on a local level, I think it was CBS Denver, which again has nothing to do with what that situation was. That's garbage. Just to keep it quite frank. I mean, I don't know. Again, I know he's Deion Sanders, and I want to get back to that too, because he's going to be who he wants to be, and I know that you're not going to change that. But there's also a line between respectful and disrespectful, and I believe he crossed that line whenever he was talking to that reporter who wouldn't let him ask his question. So, and that's what I mean by acting professional, Five Lefts. I don't mean he needs to be all buttoned up and just kind of be a robot and say whatever it is he's supposed to say. I'm not saying he needs to do that, Five Lefts. But he does need to be aware of how he's coming across with individual interactions with the media. Especially, like, again, I've already said my piece about it. I don't want to keep rambling, but that's my overall problem with what happened. So I'm not upset at Deion Sanders as a player. I'm not upset with him. I mean, I think I'm upset with him as a human being and what he did, just because I think it was wrong what he did. Because if that was me, I mean, and this is probably coming off a little, I don't know. I mean, I'm younger than most people who are in the reporting media business, but I mean that would have hurt. I mean, I hope I would have carried myself well and handled it well. But if I was that reporter who was speaking with Deion Sanders and I didn't get to ask my question, I mean that'd probably be a little deflating. And again, my feelings don't matter in this. I guess I don't want to make it about that. I always try to put myself in other people's shoes whenever things like this happen. So that's just what I wanted to address when it comes to that. Hopefully, I cleared some things up on how I guess just how I feel about what Deion said when it comes to the reporters and stuff like that. So we'll move on. What else we got here? I know I want to save some time for some reaction to Malachi Moreno. I know, but we do have some more time to get into a few other things before we do that. So let's get into it. Next week, there is going to be a meeting between people involved at schools with a group of 5 about potentially coming together to create a group of 5 playoff. Because as we all know, the group of 5 is never going to be a serious factor when it comes to the actual college football playoff. I do think they get an automatic bid. The highest ranked G5 team will get a spot in the playoff. I kind of have issues with that. I understand why they're doing it because they don't want to leave out a really good G5 team. But there may be years where the best G5 team is maybe 9-3, 8-4. And again, that may not matter too much, but and you may have, I don't think you'll have years where it's worse than that because you're always going to have teams that just have better records because not everybody's 9-3 is the same. A 9-3 in the MAC is a little different than 9-3 in the SEC or the Big Ten. A 9-3 team in the MAC may have gotten completely slaughtered by all 3 of their non-conference opponents that were a part of Power 5 programs, but they may have just run the table in their conference. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. But the group of 5 kind of realized, like, hey, we want our athletes to be able to, compete at, I say the highest level, I guess just for a title in some way, shape, or form. So we're going to get ahead of this game and kind of get some talks going about. I mean, it really, what it kind of reminds me of, it kind of sounds like the NIT of college football. And it would probably be good for those schools that never get to have their moment at the highest level. I mean, you may see, I'll use Western Kentucky as an example. They're a team that if they have a really good year would probably thrive in a group of 5, 12-team playoff. They may have a shot to win the G5 championship. But here's what you do with that. At that point, you're almost creating another Division I subdivision because you already have the FBS and the FCS dividing the current dividing line between the higher ups and the lower downs, I should say, of college football. And that's completely run by the NCAA. The FCS championship is. The FBS championship, the college football playoff national title game, has nothing to do with the NCAA. And it'll be interesting to see if the G5 ends up doing their own thing. Will it eventually turn into their own subdivision? We have the FBS, the FCS, and I don't know, the FGS. Again, that's probably not what it would be called, and maybe that's not even what would become of something like this. But if that does end up coming to fruition, you probably at first there won't be any separation of divisions or anything like that. But you may see another alteration of the overall college football playoff. Maybe you won't see G5 teams included at all unless they just happen to be the very best team. Which more often than not is not the case. The best example we've ever seen of that is Cincinnati a few years ago. So I don't know what to think of if I think it'll actually happen. I mean, maybe I do know what to think because I do think there's a good chance that down the road. I don't know how many years into the future it happens, but I do think there's a good chance down the road that you do see a G5 playoff that would include like the MAC, Conference USA, Sun Belt, Mountain West, whoever else I may be forgetting, the American Athletic Conference. So, and at that point, I almost feel like you have to do a different division, because if they're playing for their own championship, just like the FCS is, like where the Big East Football Conference is, which is just weird. Or do they even have a football conference? I know there's Big East teams that have football programs. I don't know if they actually have a Big East conference though anymore. But either way, the FCS is their own thing. I guess you can still play FBS teams if you created your own G5 league, if you will, just because there are still FCS teams that play once a year, or the FBS teams play once a year. But it would be very, very odd, to say the least, if that ends up being where we go from there. So one other thing I want to get into, and then we'll move towards our final portion of the show. And that is something that I've seen on social media a lot this week, just because, again, we are very close to college football season. And this is something that at this time of year always kind of becomes a big, what's the word? I don't know if talking point is the right phrase for it, but just a big social media thing, especially on Twitter. Maybe you don't get it as much on Facebook or Instagram, TikTok, whatever it may be. But that is football and fall weddings. There is a big contingency of college football fans who have and I'm kind of in this category, not as much as I used to be, just because I feel like with maturity and getting older, I understand that life doesn't revolve around college sports or really sports in general. But it can be very aggravating if you have multiple fall weddings that you are, I don't mean to say obligated, that's just where my brain went, that you need to attend or invited to attend, and you may end up missing a few big college football Saturdays. And there's a big contingency of people that say we should ban fall weddings. And I know they kind of say it tongue in cheek, but it's just because people don't want to be inconvenienced to not be able to watch their favorite team play on Saturday. Because obviously weddings, for the most part, are on Saturdays. And again, I get it. Life doesn't revolve around college football. At least it shouldn't. I love watching Indiana play, even if they aren't very good. And I'm hoping that changes this year. But sometimes you got to suck it up. I'll tell you what, there's one Saturday every year that I miss now, every year, because I go to Louder Than Life in here in Louisville, Kentucky, every single year. And I don't always go on Saturday, but this year I'm going on Saturday. So there's a decent chance that I won't watch any of who Indiana plays that day on that day. I'll watch it later. And I do believe they play Maryland that week, if I'm not mistaken. But there's always going to be things in life that keep us from watching a game or attending a game, whatever it may be. But I get it. It can be very annoying if you've got, maybe you have a very huge family and it's very, it's often that you have to attend such weddings, and maybe there's a lot in the fall. I could see where that would get a little aggravating. Because those people, what happens is the people who schedule those weddings, they don't care at all about college football. Maybe I could be wrong about that in some cases, because I'll say this. My wife and I were originally supposed to get married on April 4th of 2020. We ended up shifting that a little bit because obviously that was right around when COVID really started becoming a national, even global issue at that point. But our original wedding date was April 4th, 2020. And for basketball fans who are listening to this, that is traditionally not even, I mean, that is when the Final Four weekend is usually, all the time, I should say. I need to stop saying usually. That is when the Final Four weekend is. The first weekend in April is when the NCAA basketball Final Four is. And living in Kentucky, and even if I was living in Indiana, I know Indiana hasn't competed for a Final Four in a long time, but living in Kentucky with Louisville and Kentucky fans all around us, one of the first things we heard from people is, well, that's the weekend of the Final Four. You can't have your wedding then. What if Kentucky's in the Final Four? You can have a TV for it? What if Louisville's in the Final Four? And of course, I didn't care. I was like, yeah, that's fine. We'll have the game on if they're playing. Now, again, that never ended up happening, of course. So yeah, maybe people aren't as aware of when they're scheduling, because I mean, it's not about college football or even college basketball. It's about the wedding. Um, Even though if I'm being completely honest, I'm not a big fan of having to give up my college football Saturday. I'll do it, but I don't like to do it. So we'll leave that at that. I just wanted to bring that up because that's been all over the nonsensical portion of Twitter this week. All right, I just got done watching the Malachi Moreno announcement live stream, and some of you may have already seen it because obviously this episode of the show will release a little bit after that happens. But he ended up choosing the University of Kentucky over 7 other different schools, including Indiana, who was believed to be deep in the running in this one. Some people even thought that Indiana was the favorite at one point, but he ended up choosing to go to Kentucky. And it's not all that surprising. He lives in Georgetown, goes to Great Crossing. I believe him and Mark Pope have created a really good relationship, and I'm sure he'll make a nice fit with the Wildcats. And first, I guess, big miss. I don't want to call it a big miss. I mean, the recruiting season is still early on, but it's the first miss of the 2025 class for Mike Woodson. At least somebody he was believed to be highly involved in, I should say. And now attention turns to the other guys that have been really focused on when it comes to the freshmen for the 2025 class. And the top 2 guys really being Trent Sisley and Braylon Mullins. And again, I've talked multiple times how it's not necessarily important to have a huge freshman class in this day and age of college basketball when you factor in the transfer portal and all that type of stuff. But we already know that Indiana is going to be missing not even missing, they're going to be losing a lot of talent when it comes to those that will be leaving the roster at the end of the 2024-2025 year. I'm going to pull up that scholarship count here in just a moment. So yeah, you're going to automatically have to fill 6 spots based on players who will be out of eligibility going into, at the end of next year. So, and on top of that, you have to think about the guys who may leave due to their NBA prospects as well. So it's definitely going to be important to grab at least a couple guys, 2 to 3 guys, really, I would think, for this freshman class. And it's unfortunate that Indiana missed out on this one, Malachi Moreno. If I were ranking the level of importance of the 3 guys I've mentioned here in this segment here between Sisley, Moreno, and Mullins, I probably would have put Moreno at the bottom, mainly, and not because he's the least talented of the 3 or anything like that. It just seems like from the get-go, Sisley and Mullins have been a higher priority for Mike Woodson as compared to Malachi Moreno. So it's definitely going to be important for Indiana to potentially land both of those guys in the freshman class, at the very least one of them. And if you miss all 3, then you kind of find yourself in the same position that you were in last year, where you don't have anybody in the class except one. It was kind of weird. You had Liam McNeely, and then nothing happened. Then you lost him, and then you had Bryson Tucker, and that's how last year shaped out. You kind of want to avoid being in that position next year, I feel like, if you're Mike Woodson. So we'll keep an eye on it. The first domino has fallen, not in Indiana's favor this time around, as 4-star prospect, well, maybe 5, depending on which recruiting site you're looking at, as Malachi Moreno decides to continue his basketball career at the University of Kentucky and with Mark Pope. So that's going to wrap up today's episode. Again, thank you for checking in. I'm sorry I wasn't here on Wednesday. Hopefully things will stay normal. We'll be back to our regular Monday, Wednesday, and Friday schedule next week. I appreciate you guys for being patient. And be sure to check out everything that's going on HoosierIllustrated.com. Again, check out the Indiana football preview, the Talking About the Hoosiers podcast that Drew and Kyler invited me to join on earlier this week. And be sure to subscribe on YouTube. Leave a comment, like, share, whatever it is. Do all those things if you don't mind. And again, as always, feel free to leave a message on the hotline, 502-830-9195. I don't mean to neglect that. I do believe there was a couple of messages potentially that I could have gotten to today. We'll save those for next week. And feel free to leave one yourself. And until next time, this has been another edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, presented by HoosierIllustrated.com.